My name is Rafe Gray. Not my real name, of course. I cannot divulge my real name for reasons that will become abundantly clear as you listen to this podcast. This is the fourth and final episode of a podcast about a murder that took place in Burton-on-Trent in the late 60s. In March 1971, a person local to the town discovered a body on a small island in the River Trent. The body was, and is, referred to as Fred the Head. The island was not easily accessible, and still isn't, even today. It is a secluded spot opposite the Royal Oak pub, which at the time the locals called the Sump Hole. You see, I know who the murder victim was and who killed him. There is copious information on the internet and in the press about this case, but most of it is based on conjecture, third-party testimony, and, to be honest, misinformation. Fred was discovered interred in a kneeling position. His hands and feet were bound with cord. He had torticollis, a deformation of the upper spinal cord that resulted, in Fred's case, as a visible and perceptible crooked deformity in his neck. I knew Fred and had met him on several occasions around the town. I disliked him intensely. Why? Because I knew that he had a sexual predilection for young boys and girls. In short, he disgusted me. How do I know so much about the murder? Well, I was there when it took place. But before talking about the murder, I want to continue what I outlined in the previous 3 episodes, a summary of my now-deceased Uncle Horace Gray's past and my involvement in his criminal activities. In this episode, I explain how I went with my uncle to meet Fred for the first time, and how eventually he, along with 2 of his fellow countrymen, met their unfortunate end. In episode 3, I talked about the growing tensions between the West and the USSR, tensions that George Orwell, in an essay in 1945, was the first to refer to as the Cold War. 2 world wars left Britain bankrupt, and, inevitably, it and its empire entered into a steep decline. Despite this decline, Brezhnev regarded Britain, a close ally of the United States, as an important target for espionage, not only because of its geopolitical ties, but also because it still had an enviable reputation for scientific and technological advancements in the military sphere. Espionage was nothing new. It had already taken place decades before, albeit mainly for ideological reasons, vis-a-vis the Cambridge Five, whose activities started in the 1930s. But it proliferated on both sides, due, amongst other things, to the nuclear arms race. Even prior to the Americans dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Russians had been developing nuclear weapons of their own, and the desire was overwhelming on either side to monitor what the other side was doing. Allow me to get back to talking about my uncle momentarily. His criminal activities were now occupying most of his time, but he still had close ties to, and occasionally met with, Sir Stanley and Jacob Menzies, both of whom held high positions in the Secret Service in Whitehall. Indeed, Sir Stanley and Jacob had previously relied on my uncle's services to carry out some of their, shall we say, shady dealings. They still relied on him from time to time. The Secret Services valued their contacts in the criminal underworld, contacts who, if the need arose, would be able to not only monitor and provide them with information about planned criminal acts, but also to, if necessary, eliminate without hesitation or remorse those who the state considered to be a threat to the nation. This reliance on the criminal underworld continues to this day. Don't believe me? A relatively recent article in 2018 in the Independent newspaper discussed why Theresa May published to Parliament previously secret guidelines on MI5's use of criminals to carry out activities on their behalf. Below is a quote from the article. In a written statement to Parliament, Ms. May referred to a direction which instructed the Investigatory Powers Commissioner to keep under review the application of the Security Service guidelines on the use of agents who participate in criminality and the authorizations issued in accordance with them. And further, human rights organization Reprieve said it was the first time the government had acknowledged that guidance existed within the UK to regulate such activity. In the early 1960s, my uncle introduced me to Sir Stanley and Jacob, together with Jacob's fiancée, Helen, who was Sir Stanley's daughter. In fact, I met both men on several occasions at Sir Stanley's home in Burton-on-Trent, or, if sensitive matters needed to be discussed, elsewhere in the town. I recall at the age of 13 or 14 walking with Sir Stanley, Jacob and my uncle in Stapenhill Gardens. It was as a result of one such meeting that my uncle tasked me with keeping an eye on certain individuals in the town. My duties consisted of following the surveillance targets and reporting back on where they were, where they'd been, and what they'd been doing, no matter how trivial their activities. If the targets were deemed to be of special interest, I was assigned to report to designated on-site agents rather than my uncle. These agents would sometimes wait in a vehicle parked nearby, and I would cycle past and ring my bell to let them know that I had spotted such and such a person entering one of the establishments in town over which they had been keeping watch at a distance. Back to Fred and how I got to meet him for the first time. My uncle told me in the mid-1960s that the Secret Service had asked him to travel to the northeast to meet 3 men, to befriend them and coax them back to Burton-on-Trent. He asked me to accompany him on the journey. The pretext for bringing the men to Burton was that they would be able to blend in and make a decent living, and that there were a number of interesting military installations in and around the Midlands. My uncle didn't divulge to me everything he knew about the men, but I suspected that he intended to persuade them that he was sympathetic with their cause and that they would be remunerated well if they worked for him in his criminal enterprise. What better way to keep an eye on them? So, what was the men's cause? You see, they had travelled to the UK from Eastern Europe. They'd arrived on a ship most probably at Hartlepool, and all were now staying either in Durham or Peterlee. In fact, my uncle travelled to Durham several times thereafter until, eventually, the men returned to Burton-on-Trent with him. I didn't accompany him on every trip. I don't recall the assumed British names of 2 of the men, but I do remember one of them being called Paul Waldron. All of them had somewhat unusual accents, a weird combination of Geordie and Eastern European. Their strange accents, the way that they conducted themselves and their interesting backstories, most likely made up, meant that the people in the town with whom they mixed soon accepted them. They spent a few months working menial jobs and sustaining themselves with the money my uncle paid them. Well, Paul Waldron anyway. In fact, Paul became so well integrated that he acquired the nickname Pete Lee, because Peterlee is where he'd been staying upon his arrival in Britain. Until, that is, my uncle persuaded him and his friends to come to Burton. I have no idea what they got up to in terms of fulfilling their roles as foreign agents. I left it to my uncle and Jacob Menzies to determine that side of things. Sir Stanley had retired soon after the men's move to Burton, and I had started to try to distance myself from my uncle's more nefarious activities. At the age of 15, I started to work in the garage trade, and by 1966 was working at Smith's Garage in Rosliston Road, Stapenhill. I went on to take a number of different jobs, including shift work in an iron foundry, where Jacob, via my uncle, asked me to keep an eye on one of the union leaders. Personally, as mentioned in a previous episode, I disliked Pete Lee intensely. I'd noticed that he liked the company of underage girls and boys, and on one occasion, I saw him standing outside a school talking through the fence to a group of girls. I went over and challenged him, and when he remonstrated, I manhandled him around the corner and punched him in the face. He avoided me from then on, for obvious reasons, but I still saw him about town and occasionally drank in the pubs that he frequented. By 1968, the Secret Service's investigations had progressed into the real motivations of the 3 men from the Northeast for being in the UK. I was not privy to the discussions, but the Secret Service had apparently decided that 2 of the men, Pete Lee's 2 friends, perhaps accomplices, should be terminated. I was told later that it had been decided that Pete Lee would be dealt with separately for whatever reason. His 2 friends were taken to the shambles of a hut of someone called George Robinson, a.k.a. Fred Armitage, a man who owned several Alsatian dogs. Fred Armitage was a dishevelled man whom the locals regarded as somewhat eccentric, taciturn and unapproachable, and not just because of his vicious pets. Apparently, the 2 men were killed and buried in wasteland near to the River Trent, which 2 years later would be the site upon which a boat club was built. However, I know more about Pete Lee's fate than that of his two friends. You see, as you've probably already determined, Pete Lee is, in fact, Fred the Head. My uncle, Horace Gray, not his real name, asked me a few days later to entice Pete Lee to the huts at Bladon Woods, the huts that my great-uncle Bill had moved from Fald Barracks and installed there. This was not an easy task, given that I had already physically assaulted Pete Lee. However, in the days that followed, I managed to regain his confidence by explaining my actions as a misunderstanding and telling him that I, too, was not averse to fancying young girls. Indeed, I subsequently told him that I had a secret location at which I met girls to have sex. In fact, on the night that my uncle instructed me to entrap Pete Lee, I tried to sort him by visiting various pubs with no avail, but then found him at his flat in Ashby Road, persuaded him relatively easily in his drunk state that I had a tryst with two young girls that very evening in the huts in the woods. The victim accompanied me willingly to the secret remote location. My job was to entice him into the huts and wait outside for further instructions. I told Pete Lee to enter the huts. The lights inside were already on. I told him that I would join him once he'd introduced himself to the young girls inside. Whilst waiting, I noticed that a black Rover 75 P4 car was parked outside the huts a few yards away. I made a mental note of the registration number. I will explain the significance of this later on. Pete Lee entered the huts expectantly. I have no recollection of any shouting or screaming or, in fact, who or how many awaited him inside. I stayed outside waiting anxiously until about an hour later when the hut door opened. Someone instructed me to make my way down to the River Trent to open the gate that led to the small island in the river not far from the Sump Hole pub. I opened the gate easily by squeezing around one of the gate posts and lifting the latch on the other side. Having opened the gate, I waited nervously for what would happen next. I didn't have to wait long. The black Rover soon turned up and the boot was opened. Inside, I saw a body. I stepped back. Two men carried the body across the narrow strait that led to the island. Panting, I ran away. I surmised that the body being transported from the boot of the car to the burial place was that of Pete Lee. I wondered whether, given the lack of the victim's distress and protestations, he'd been killed using the same method of assassination that my uncle had employed when he murdered the priest in Romford. Following this event, I withdrew completely. I spent the rest of my teenage years looking over my shoulders. I no longer agreed to carry out surveillance activities at my uncle's or his mandarin's request. I distanced myself from his or his paymaster's directives. I would like to say this in summary. I have had a successful and fulfilling life and overseen the burgeoning of a law-abiding and loving family. I have even reported to the police everything that I have disclosed in this podcast. Do you think that I am mad or delusional? Well, that's up to you. My conscience is clear. Is yours? By the way, I now own, due to serendipity, the black Rover that I saw parked outside the huts in Bladon Woods. I know. You couldn't make it up, right? Fact is often stranger than fiction. No, really, it is. Thank you for listening, and in the meantime, stay safe.